Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. If you're listening to this on the day it was released, that means it's Sunday. This is the first week I'm releasing all my episodes on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday as opposed to just Friday. If you haven't listened to my other two episodes yet, feel free to. They're all about how to run Prison Break arcs. In keeping to theme, this week's story is all about a Prison Break arc I ran in my current campaign. So, without any further announcements, what happened? To begin with some context, my players were asked to retrieve a very powerful magical item for the leader of the Dynast, a big city that they started the campaign in. One of my players, a detective at the time, was also already on a case of his own. He was looking for the groundskeeper of a local university who had gone missing. Well, they all went on their quest and found the item, but they elected to give it to one of their party members' warlock patron instead. There was no sign of the missing person, so they returned completely empty-handed to the Dynast. And I'm going to say this is where the story begins in earnest. You can probably see where it's going from here anyway. The guards at the gate elected to escort them to the Dynast's palace upon their return, collecting more guards along the way. My players knew something was up, as more and more guards filtered into the party bringing them to the palace, but they also knew better than to act on it just then, so they played along. When they arrived at the palace, they were surprised to see none other than the very person the detective was sent to find, along with the Dynast and a cleric. The cleric cast a quick detect thought spell on my party, as the old groundskeeper began shouting hysterically at their detective, accusing him of being the one to kidnap her. She knew he was low on cases, and said that he'd planned to return her collecting the reward for the crime he committed. He denied this, and rightfully so. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, it just wasn't true. The cleric looked puzzled. They're all telling the truth, she told the Dynast, but the Dynast didn't care. She looked at the party and asked them, okay, so where is it? Oh, we gave it to someone else, they said, hoping that honesty was the best policy. It wasn't. The cleric looked up. It's true, she said, and that was all the Dynast needed to hear. She gave the order to arrest them, as the guards grabbed them and hauled them outside where an airship was waiting. For those of you who have been with me for a while, you might recognize this is the origin story for the Don't Mess with Pixies story I told a while back on the show. If you haven't listened to it, feel free to, but this also means that it follows our friends V, short for Viamis, the Changing Warlock, 57, the Ooze Detective, and Creve, the Dragonborn Paladin. There are two more players who take place in this story, and don't worry, we'll meet them briefly, but for now, I want to tell a few mini-stories from the travel to the prison because they were also kind of funny. First, after they all piled onto the small airship, the guards gave them jumpsuits and told them to change into them. V happened to be wearing a set of glamour clothes, so he prestidigitated a sound behind them, and when they turned, made his clothes look like the jumpsuit, and hid the actual jumpsuit in his clothes. I know they'd wonder where the clothes of his went, but these guards weren't the brightest, so it slid right past them. Second, they slapped a bunch of bracelets on them. If they tried to cast any magic, it simply didn't work. They had to get those off somehow, but they each had a lock on them, so if they could find the key, they'd practically be free. And finally, they all took their pets and stored them in one of the lower decks. However, they didn't know that one of them, the Flumph, was V's familiar. All he had to do was to spell it and recast it after a little while. Once he did this, he sent it down a little further down the hall, looking for the other animal companions and maybe even a way out. But all it ended up finding was another guard walking in the opposite direction. He stopped, blinked his eyes, and went for his sword. But the Flumph had the upper hand. It floated up, spun its body around, and slapped him across the face. While the man was reeling from the incredible pain apparently caused from the Flumph tentacle slapping in the face, the Flumph scurried away, only to run into another guard who had been alerted by the commotion. As he drew his sword, the Flumph released a stinking cloud, incapacitating the man and the several other guards who had appeared around them. The Flumph doubled back, trying to remember the way, but was even so still surrounded. But it still had one trick up its sleeve. I don't know, Flumphs don't wear sleeves, but I guess it would technically be V's sleeve, because as one of the guards swung his sword, the Flumph disappeared, dispelled. But even so, that Flumph did a lot. It survived a lot longer than I thought it would. Anyway, a particularly disgruntled guard ran back to the cell the party was kept in, stinking and coughing up a storm, only to see them just sitting around and lounging like normal. The guards groaned and walked away. But 57 still had a plan. He was an ooze after all. He could just slip between the bars and wander into the hall, which he did. The guards tried to stop him, but he wasn't doing anything and seemed pretty harmless. Plus, every time they tried to drag him back to his cell, he just kind of slipped out and kept walking with them, so they just kind of let him do it. An older guard thought this was particularly funny, so they took him back to the lounge where they dealt him into the card game that they were playing at the time. After a few hours, 57 eventually returned, and when V asked him if he found out where their pets were being stored or where the key to their bindings was, 57 just snored, immediately falling asleep. He'd completely forgotten to ask them, or even look for them. And as night fell over the flying airship, one by one they eventually decided to get some sleep before they were promptly woken up next morning in an area surrounded by other stationary airships and covered in sheets of ice and snow. And before them was a giant mountain with a barred over heavy iron-looking door carved into the side. They were led inside down an elevator. V swore that he noticed another door on the way down. A stop to the elevator could have made, but did not, but he couldn't investigate it just then. Not yet. 57 was dropped in a cell across from V, V, but in a different block, and V was shoved into a cell along with an elf, a drow by the looks of her, named Val. This is one of the other players that was playing in this campaign at this point in time. But Creve was taken far across to the other side of the prison. Not only was he going to be in a different cell block, it was work time. He was corralled into a wide open mine and told to get to it, and he did, but only absent-mindedly. His main focus is on the surrounding cave he'd found himself in. He walked over to another dragonborn and began chipping away at a cave wall. He saw a few cells suspended way above them in a nest of chains, all by themselves with only an elevator leading up to them. Not so far off, there's also an arena, empty for now, but its presence still filled Creve with a sense of dread he could hardly explain. He'd nearly forgotten that the other dragonborn was there when he looked over, startling Creve, and said, "I'm more interested in that door over there." He pointed to a small wooden door that Creve hadn't even noticed. "That's a good eye," said Creve. "What's your name anyway?" He introduced himself as Empirin, and for those of you who have listened to that Don't Mess with Pixies episode I mentioned earlier, you'll probably recognize him from that episode. The two started making light conversation. Well, it wasn't exactly light. Creve asked Empirin how he ended up here. "Really?" he said. "We're having this conversation?" He explained that a noble had killed his family, and that he was with the group, that he left seeking revenge, and then was caught and brought here. And after Empirin asked him the same thing, he said that somebody that he was traveling with was accused of kidnapping, a blue ooze named 57. It took Empirin a minute to stop shaking his head until he realized, yep, he knows those guys. Meanwhile, back in the cells, V was just minding his own business when he heard a knock sound against the wall. V looked over and peeked out of his cell. He saw a little goblin staring back at him, eyes wide and blinking. It was an old friend of his, someone he used to work with, and Stubb was his name. Apparently, his sister Moss was also imprisoned here as well. They'd been separated after causing too much trouble apparently, but due to her location across the prison, they decided they could use her to transmit messages from the other inmates to each other. They discussed the door by the elevator and possible other ways of getting out, only to realize they didn't really have a plan yet, only apparently to interrupt another prisoner who was painting apparently across the hall. She was a little gnome with a shock of silver gray hair and apparently had no patience for conversation. The satyr that she shared her cell with, on the other hand, was nothing but smiles and laughs as he strummed on his little lute. "You're not fooling anyone," said the satyr. "We all know you're mixing the chemicals from your paints. You want a way out of here just as much as we do." V couldn't shake the feeling that he was interrupting something, but still wanted to know if they could help. Eventually, it came out that they might have a way of helping everyone get their bindings off. Vic, the satyr, explained that Lana, the gnome, was apparently very smart, and if anyone could help them get their bindings off, it was definitely her. But V would have to meet them during free time in the workshop, where she could mix all of her ingredients together to make the things she needed to make. To do so, V was hesitant, but they seemed helpful enough, so he agreed. And it wasn't long before he, Stubb, Val, and the rest of their block were let out to work. Some of them went to the mines, others went to the workshop, but those three, along with some others, were guided into the kitchen to serve lunch. Val was shown to an elevator that led down to a well where she could gather water from. Just beneath the surface, the entrance was covered with nets of chain that were firmly attached to the stony sides of the wall. Apparently, previous inmates had tried to escape this way before, but by the time she returned, chaos had broken out in the cafeteria. V served lunch to Creve and Empirin, agreed to help them, and said they had allies inside. However, it wasn't very long before Empirin became targeted by a large bugbear woman sent by the noble he attacked. She rushed him, and Creve tried to step in the way, but she swatted him aside with no issue. She made it to Empirin and pinned him to the wall, but Creve knew he had to help. He ran up behind them and shoved a table into them, causing her to release Empirin, temporarily pinning her to the wall, but she turned around, pushed the table back, pounced on, and grabbed a tray, ready to hit him in the head with it. But before she could actually cave his face in with it, a cluster of guards scurried up to them, pulled them away from each other, and carried them off to the mines, where they were deposited into those small chambers they saw earlier, way up from the cave floor. "So those are your friends, huh?" Stubb asked V. And while Creve and Empirin were enjoying the comfort of their solitary cells, the rest of their friends were actually enjoying free time. V had an appointment to keep. He arrived in the workshop with the smell of sawdust filling his nose. Apparently, some of the materials Lana needed to make whatever she was trying to make were in here somewhere, but they needed to get rid of the guards standing in their way. "Do you think you could do that?" Vic asked, wearing his usual smile. V looked down at Stubb, but the little goblin was already on it. He tore off his jumpsuit, let loose a rabid howl, which was really more like a high-pitched yelp, and ran out of the room. The guards chased after him, followed by another shout, and the sound of breaking glass from somewhere. "You know, I like him," said Vic as Lana turned around, with 2 little vials of liquid, saying that they're potions that can transform the person who drinks them into something small, so that you can slip out of those bracelets. And soon V headed back to hang out with some of his other party members and exchange what they knew. But at the end of free time, they weren't sent back to their cells. They were all herded into the arena in the mines. The warden, a little pale gnome, walked onto the center of the stage, and that was in the middle of the arena, with Creve, Empirin, the bugbear woman who attacked them, and Stubb in tow. Stubb had apparently been caught after the distraction he made for V earlier. He announced there was to be a tournament. The inmates who wanted to volunteer to do so would fight amongst themselves in groups and among monsters that he had procured for this purpose. The winning group was to be given their freedom, and he announced their first 4 volunteers. My players saw through this, but they volunteered one by one so their friends wouldn't have to fight alone. But it didn't matter. One of the monsters the warden had referred to pounced in, breaking through one of the walls. Stone crumbled to the ground as a bullet, all 4 of its legs and shoveled shovel-like face diving into the room. The other prisoners tried to run away, screaming and trying to make a break for it. The guards managed to corral them. Vic and Lana were nowhere to be seen, and the warden and his top henchmen were also nowhere to be seen. V and a few of his friends ran to the entrance of the elevator they came in on that led to the mines to investigate that door he saw earlier. Moss, the other goblin Stubb and V were talking about before, managed to lockpick the door and get it open, and it led into a room full of chests and a cage where all of their animal companions were being held. Cree fell unconscious fighting the raging Violette, and it took Val to drag him to the safety of the storage room. Empyrean, meanwhile, ran into that door he'd found earlier. The blast of the Violette left it hanging off its hinges, and inside he found what appeared to be a lab of some kind with parts of various creatures suspended in liquid and others trapped in cages. But the most staggering sight was trapped inside a giant cage in the back of the room. It was so gargantuan in fact that it extended above the ceiling and below the floor, and required a whole room practically to itself. It was a misshapen giant, and the moment it saw Empyrean, it shouted incomprehensibly. But Empyrean had a plan. He grabbed a rock and started beating at the lock. He wanted to open it and allow the giant to roam freely, letting him and his friends escape. And as the giant warped and tore at the bars to no avail, Empyrean found himself having to climb the cage and get back to the lock, rather, several locks, that held this thing in. And by the time they broke, it swung the door open like it was nothing, flinging Empyrean to the ground. He rolled to the side and looked to his left. A narrow hall extended off to the side. He bolted down that way as the creature lumbered into the mines. He found a door leading into a storage room with his friends on the other side. They let him in, and he found his stuff. It wasn't long before the warden and his top guard showed up at the door. But as soon as they got there, V closed it in their face. I had him roll an opposed athletics check to close in on them because the others were trying to push it open as well, and he natural 20'd it. So he definitely succeeded. Yep, sometimes this happens. You make an entire boss fight only for your players to completely avoid it. Anyway, at this time, Lana burst into the room from the other door, the one Empyrean had walked through, and said they better follow her if they wanted to get out of here. They ran out with her as she guided them through the maze of hallways, and they made it out into the same snowy field of airships they had landed at when they first got here. From there, as guards funneled out of the prison after them, they piled into an airship. It was small and a little rough, but it was the closest one, and more importantly, it would fly. Pursued by guards mounting other airships, they soared away over the frozen landscape. And that's where I'm going to end it. I knew this was going to end up being kind of a long one, but man, that was a lot. I had to omit quite a bit so that I could fit this story into one episode. If you want to hear those little omitted parts, let me know. There's also the fight on the airship as they fled, which was also kind of fun. If you want to hear that, let me know as well. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, which I hope you did, come back next week where I'll be finishing the story of Luna that I started a few weeks ago and talking about how I handle some of the more troublesome players that we may get occasionally. As always, thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. Until next time, let's learn something.